Imagine being dragged into a crowded square, not for murder, not for treason, but because you spoke too loudly, or defied your husband, or simply dressed the wrong way. The punishment isn't death, not yet. It's something worse. A sentence designed to humiliate you, to crush your spirit long before your body breaks. For centuries, women across Europe lived under laws that treated their voices as dangerous, their desires as criminal, and their very existence as a thing to control. Devices of iron and wood, not just tools of pain, but of shame, were strapped to faces and bodies to remind everyone watching exactly who held the power. This is the dark history of punishments meant only for women. A story of fear, control, and public humiliation hidden beneath the cobblestones of Europe's marketplaces and dungeons. When we think of medieval torture, we imagine shadowy dungeons, spiked wheels, or the dreaded rack. But not all punishments were about breaking bones. Some were about breaking reputations. Public humiliation was one of history's most powerful weapons, and for women, it often became a weapon of control. From England to Germany to Italy, entire towns would gather to watch justice performed in broad daylight. Punishments for gossip, disobedience, or suspected immorality were spectacles. They didn't just discipline an individual, they sent a message to every woman watching. Stay silent, stay obedient, stay in your place. These were not isolated incidents. For nearly 500 years, Europe developed entire systems of gender-specific justice. Certain crimes, scolding, nagging, loose behavior, existed only on paper when applied to women. The devices built to punish them were horrifying not just in their cruelty, but in their symbolism. In this episode, we'll explore some of the most notorious examples. The iron scold's bridle, the ducking stool, public shaming rituals, and the unspoken fear that kept women under constant threat of humiliation. Let's begin in 16th century Britain. The village square is crowded. A woman, accused of scolding, or speaking sharply to a man in public, is led forward in chains. She hasn't stolen anything. She hasn't committed treason. Her only crime is using her voice too much. The sentence? A device called the scold's bridle. It looks like a metal cage that fits over the head like a helmet. Inside, a flat plate presses against the tongue. Once locked, it makes speaking impossible and painful if you try. Sometimes, sharp spikes were added to pierce the tongue if the wearer dared move it. The woman is paraded through town while onlookers jeer and laugh. The message is clear. Words are dangerous when they come from the wrong mouth. The scold's bridle became common in England, Scotland, and parts of Germany from the 1500s to the early 1700s. Local courts used it against women accused of gossiping, slandering neighbors, or simply being disruptive. Records from the town of Newcastle in 1567 describe a woman named Bessie Tailbois, sentenced to wear the bridle after she insulted a local merchant. She was walked from street to street while a town crier announced her crime. Not theft, not violence, just talking. The punishment was doubly cruel because it combined pain with shame. By making her a spectacle, it warned every other woman that public speech carried a price. Even after the device fell out of use, its memory haunted communities for generations. It wasn't just about silencing one woman, it was about silencing an entire gender. If the scold's bridle was designed to silence women, the ducking stool was designed to humiliate them in full view of their neighbors. Picture a wooden chair fastened to the end of a long beam, hanging over a river or town pond. The accused woman would be strapped into the chair, unable to move, unable to protect herself, while crowds gathered on the shore. At the signal, the chair was swung out and plunged into the water, then hauled up again over and over until the lesson was learned. This punishment was widely used from the late Middle Ages into the 18th century, especially in England and colonial America. Officially, it targeted women convicted of disorderly conduct or immoral behavior. In practice, it was often used against those accused of witchcraft, prostitution, or scolding their husbands. The ducking stool had a special kind of cruelty. Unlike execution, the goal wasn't to kill, though deaths did occur. The real purpose was public degradation. The sight of a drenched, gasping, terrified woman struggling for air reinforced the community's power over her body. One 1623 record from Canterbury, England, describes a woman named Dorothy Waugh ducked 3 times in the River Stour for her unquiet tongue. Local accounts note that many townsfolk attended, finding much sport in the spectacle. To the people watching, this wasn't just punishment. It was entertainment. The ducking stool was also used to test witches. In some cases, a woman was bound and lowered into water to see if she would sink or float. Floating was taken as proof of witchcraft, a bitter irony, since sinking often meant drowning. But beyond its supposed religious or moral purpose, the ducking stool was about social control. Public, humiliating punishments made examples of women who defied norms. A wife who spoke too loudly, a midwife who challenged authority, a neighbor who refused to be silent. All could find themselves strapped to a chair, facing jeers and icy water. By the 19th century, such punishments faded as legal systems modernized. But the memory of the ducking stool lingers as a symbol of how entire communities participated in shaming and controlling women, long after dungeons and racks were gone. Another form of punishment designed for humiliation was public whipping and exposure in the pillory. For men, this was often a sentence for theft or debt. For women, it was frequently tied to accusations of immorality. Women convicted of adultery, prostitution, or lewd behavior were stripped to the waist, tied to a post, and flogged, not to kill them, but to disgrace them. In 17th century London, a woman named Anne Broughton was whipped through the streets for night walking, an early term for suspected sex work. Records describe a drummer beating alongside her to attract a crowd, while townspeople threw mud and insults. The pillory, a wooden frame holding the head and hands, was equally humiliating. Women locked in the stocks for hours endured not only pain but also verbal and physical abuse from passers-by. Rotten food, filth, and sometimes stones were hurled at them. The goal was simple: to turn punishment into theater. By making shame visible, authorities hoped to scare others into submission. And because women were seen as guardians of moral order, their public disgrace was meant to purify the community as a whole. Not all punishments involved heavy iron or rushing water. Some were far more permanent, leaving marks on the body or forcing women to live under a badge of shame. In several European cities during the 1500s and 1600s, women accused of adultery, prostitution, or unchaste behavior could be branded on the forehead, shoulder, or cheek. The hot iron left a lifelong scar that publicly announced their crime. This was not just punishment, it was a social sentence that never ended. The idea was simple. If a woman could not be controlled in private, her body would carry her disgrace for all to see. Records from Augsburg, Germany, describe women branded with the letter W, for weib, meaning woman or whore, and forbidden to cover it. Any attempt to hide the scar with clothing or cosmetics brought harsher penalties. Another form of humiliation was forced dress. In some towns, convicted women were paraded through the streets wearing absurd costumes. Donkey ears, straw skirts, or rags stitched from multiple colors to signal mockery. Authorities called these moral corrections, but in reality, they turned human beings into walking warnings. Even when branding fell out of fashion, laws continued to police women's appearance. In Puritan New England, for example, women accused of adultery were made to wear a large cloth on their clothing, an infamous practice later immortalized in Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter. This wasn't just literature, it was historical reality. Unlike physical torture devices, these punishments didn't necessarily draw blood. They didn't have to. The goal was to isolate women socially, to make them visible forever as fallen or disobedient. This ensured that shame lingered long after the crowd dispersed, long after the sentence officially ended. By the 18th and 19th centuries, public torture and humiliation began to decline in Europe. Enlightenment thinkers, lawyers, and philosophers argued that punishment should fit the crime, not destroy human dignity. Judges slowly turned away from branding, bridles, and ducking stools. But it wasn't an overnight change. Devices like the scold's bridle were still recorded in use as late as 1824. The last known case of public ducking in England occurred in 1817, when a woman named Jenny Pipes was plunged into a pool in Leominster before a jeering crowd. The rise of prisons replaced the theater of punishment with confinement. While this reduced public spectacles of shame, it also erased the memory of how cruel and gendered earlier systems had been. Today, these devices sit behind glass in museums, their cold iron and warped wood gathering dust. Yet they still speak loudly about a world where a woman's voice, body, and reputation were controlled not just by law, but by fear. When we look back at these punishments, it's tempting to dismiss them as medieval curiosities. Strange iron contraptions, cruel old customs, dusty footnotes in history books. But they weren't random acts of sadism. They were systems carefully designed to send a message. Women must be controlled. The scold's bridle, the ducking stool, public whipping, branding, forced dress. All of them had two things in common. They didn't just inflict pain. They inflicted fear. They turned the female body into a stage, a public warning to anyone who dared to speak out, live freely, or challenge authority. These punishments also reveal how justice wasn't blind. Men who insulted neighbors rarely wore bridles. Men accused of adultery were rarely branded. The law treated women not as equal citizens, but as potential threats to be silenced or shamed into obedience. Even today, echoes of these attitudes remain. Modern societies may not strap people to ducking stools, but public shaming, whether in tabloids, online, or through biased laws, still disproportionately targets women for how they speak, behave, or appear. The devices may be gone, but the impulse behind them lingers. History shows us that cruelty thrives when it hides behind the mask of morality. When a punishment claims to purify or correct, rather than simply destroy, that's when it often becomes most dangerous. The next time you see a rusted scold's bridle in a museum, or a ducking stool chained to a riverbank, remember, these weren't just medieval oddities. They were tools of control. They silenced countless voices, erased countless stories, and kept entire communities living in fear. But they also left behind something unexpected, a record. Court transcripts, town diaries, and eyewitness accounts reveal the courage of the women who endured these humiliations and, in some cases, openly defied them. These stories remind us that history isn't just about kings and wars. It's about ordinary people fighting to be heard. And that's why we tell these tales on Dark Era Echoes. Not to sensationalize pain, but to understand how power works, and how easily it can twist justice into cruelty. So the next time you hear someone romanticize the good old days, remember the women who had to wear iron cages on their heads just for speaking their minds. Remember the cold water of the ducking stool. And remember that freedom of voice, something we take for granted, was once a crime worthy of torture.